The glass was a lie. It promised a connection to the city sprawled below, a glittering, crystalline nervous system of light and life. But it was a liar of the highest order. It was a barrier, cold-forged and absolute. 47 floors up, the city was just a theoretical concept, a silent film playing for an audience of one. Me. My name is Elijah Thorne, and my fortress was made of this lying glass. Its walls were my office. My armor was a hand-stitched suit from Savile Row, charcoal gray, a color that absorbed light and emotion with equal efficiency. My code was the relentless, rhythmic ticking of the billable hour, a metronome that had long ago replaced my own heartbeat. It was Christmas Eve. Down there, in the veins of light, people were living. They were rushing home with last-minute gifts, crowding into warm, loud restaurants, gathering around trees that smelled of pine and memory. They were connecting. Here, there was only the clean, sterile scent of recycled air, the low hum of the server banks in the next room, and the whisper of my own worst thoughts. I called it work. Dedication. The reason I was a senior partner at 34, that too was a lie. I was running, hiding from the crushing, cathedral-like silence of my apartment. A place so minimalist and curated, it felt more like a gallery than a home. A home is where you live. I merely occupied space. Here, in the office, the silence felt purposeful. It was the silence of focus, of power, of money being meticulously, ruthlessly generated. It was a silence I could control. I straightened a stack of files, aligning their edges with the corner of my mahogany desk. The motion was precise, automatic, a small act of order in a universe of chaos. My reflection stared back from the dark mirror of the window, a ghost in a suit, superimposed over a city of ghosts. The firm had officially closed at noon. I had wished my secretary a Merry Christmas with a warmth I did not feel, handing her an envelope containing a bonus that was obscene by any normal metric, but standard for ours. She had looked at me with a flicker of something, pity perhaps, before thanking me and hurrying away to her family. Everyone had a place to be, except for me. And him, the security guard in the lobby. I rarely saw him up close. He was a fixture, part of the building's ecosystem, like the ficus trees in the atrium or the hushed chime of the elevators. The day shift guards were chatty, ex-cops with round bellies and easy smiles. The night guard was different, younger, quieter. He moved with a stillness that was unusual, a lack of wasted motion that I, a man who equated efficiency with virtue, could appreciate on an intellectual level. I had never learned his name. It felt like a violation of some unspoken protocol. He was security. I was Mr. Thorne. These were the established orbits, and they were not meant to intersect. But tonight, the building was a vacuum. A hollowed-out shell containing only the two of us. Two solitary planets held in a delicate, unacknowledged gravitational balance. I reviewed the final clause of the merger agreement for the 10th time. The words had ceased to have meaning. They were just shapes on a page, an excuse to keep the lamp on, to keep the ghost in the window at bay. The real work was holding the walls of my own internal fortress steady against the tide of... what? Loneliness? A word too simple, too sentimental for what this felt like. This was a structural emptiness, a void. The phone on my desk remained silent. My cell phone, lying face down, was equally inert. No one would call. My parents were on a cruise in the Caribbean, a trip I had paid for as a convenient excuse for my absence. I had no siblings, The few people I might have called friends were entangled in the warm, messy webs of their own families. I was an island, by design. So why did it feel less like a sovereign nation and more like a prison? I stood up, the joints in my back cracking in protest. The suit still felt immaculate, a second skin of professionalism, but beneath it, I was frayed. I walked to the window, placing my hand against the glass. It was frigid, the cold leaching into my palm, a stark reminder of the barrier between me and everything else. The snow had started an hour ago. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes of holiday cards, but a fierce, wind-driven assault. The city lights were beginning to blur, softened by the swirling white. A blizzard. The weather reports had called for it, but I had ignored them. Weather was for people who had to go places. A flicker. The lights in my office dimmed for a second, then returned to their full, sterile brightness. A power surge. The hum of the building's climate control system faltered, then kicked back in with a deeper, more strained groan. Down there, 47 floors below, the man I didn't know was watching the same storm through his own wall of glass. Did he feel it too? This sense of being sealed in, of the world outside becoming increasingly remote and irrelevant. Probably not. He was probably just bored, counting the hours until his shift ended, thinking about a warm bed or a hot meal. His world was likely one of simple, tangible things, not this abstract prison of ambition I had built for myself. I despised the condescension in that thought, even as it formed. I knew nothing about him. Absolutely nothing. He was just the security guard, and I was just the man who couldn't go home. The second flicker was longer. The lights buzzed, turned a sickly yellow, and then died completely. Darkness. Absolute and instantaneous. The city, my silent film, vanished. The ghost in the window was gone. It was just me and the oppressive, total black. The hum of the building died, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was different. This was not the controlled silence of focus. This was the dead silence of a machine whose heart had stopped. For a full 10 seconds, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hand was still pressed against the cold glass. My heart, the one I'd forgotten I had, was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Then, the emergency systems kicked in. A low red glow emanated from the smoke detectors. A single thin beam of light from a backup fixture near the door sliced through the darkness, illuminating a stark rectangle on the plush carpet. It wasn't enough to see by, but it was enough to prove I wasn't floating in a void. My training, the part of me that was all logic and contingency plans, took over. Power failure. Stay calm. The building has backup generators for essential systems. The stairwell lights will be on. My phone. I fumbled for it on the desk, its screen flaring to life with an almost painful intensity. 92% battery. Good. I had two choices. Stay here, in the cold and dark, until the power was restored, or make my way down 47 flights of stairs to the lobby. To him, the thought of staying in this tomb, alone with the howling wind and the groaning of the building's frame, was unbearable. The fortress had become a cage. I grabbed my overcoat, a heavy cashmere thing that felt like its own form of armor. I didn't bother with my briefcase. The merger could wait. For the first time in years, the work felt utterly, profoundly irrelevant. The journey down was a descent into a different world. The emergency lights in the stairwell cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar, sterile environment into something primal and strange. The only sound was the echo of my own footsteps, the expensive leather of my dress shoes scuffing against the concrete. Each floor I passed was a layer of my identity being stripped away. The litigators on 46, mergers and acquisitions on 45, tax law on 44. Floor by floor, I shed the skin of Elijah Thorne, senior partner. By the time I reached the lobby, I felt like someone else entirely. Someone exposed. The lobby was bathed in the same dim, auxiliary light. It was vast and cold, the marble floors reflecting the weak light like a frozen lake. And in the center of it all, standing by the main security console, was him. He wasn't looking at the screens, which were all dark. He was looking at the main entrance, at the sheets of snow plastering themselves against the revolving doors. He hadn't heard me approach. He was tall, leaner than I'd thought, but with a solidness to his frame. His uniform was crisp, but it looked less like a costume and more like something he simply wore. He wasn't playing a role. He just was. He turned, a slow, deliberate movement, and his eyes found me in the gloom. There was no surprise in them, only a quiet, unnerving sense of expectation, as if he'd known I would eventually descend from my tower. "Mr. Thorne," he said. His voice was deeper than I'd imagined. Calm. It didn't echo in the cavernous space. It seemed to be absorbed by the silence, becoming part of it. "Power's out," I stated, the words sounding stupid and obvious as soon as they left my mouth. My usual eloquence, my carefully constructed vocabulary, had abandoned me. He gave a slight nod. "Citywide, sounds like. The grid is overloaded from the storm. The backup generator is running essentials, security systems, basic lights. But the HVAC and the elevators are offline." He delivered this information without inflection, a simple statement of fact. But his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue-green in the dim light, never left mine. It felt like an interrogation. "What are you still doing here?" they seemed to ask. "I was just finishing up," I lied. The lie felt flimsy, transparent. He didn't call me on it. He just kept looking at me with that steady, assessing gaze. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to seeing things people tried to hide. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled only by the muffled shriek of the wind outside. I should say something, ask a question, make a plan. But my mind was blank. The carefully organized files of my brain had been corrupted. I was operating on raw instinct, and my instinct was screaming at me that this man saw straight through my armor. He broke the silence first. "It's going to get cold in here fast." He gestured with his head toward a small, unmarked door behind the security desk. "Maintenance closet has some emergency blankets, and I have a thermos." He said it as an offering, an invitation into his space, his world of practicalities. It was a breach of protocol, a crossing of the streams. I should have refused, maintained the professional distance. I should have said I was fine, that I would wait in a chair on the far side of the lobby until I could call a car. "Okay," I heard myself say. The word hung in the air, a concession, a surrender. He nodded again, that same economical movement, and turned toward the door. "Name's Liam, by the way." Liam. The name landed in my mind and stuck there. It was a simple, solid name. A name that felt real, unlike the title, Mr. Thorne, which had started to feel like a character I was playing. "Elijah," I said to his back. He paused with his hand on the doorknob and glanced over his shoulder. A flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. As if he'd known my name all along, but was waiting for me to offer it. To give him a piece of the real me. The small act of sharing our names had shifted the gravity in the room. We were no longer just a lawyer and a security guard. We were Elijah and Liam. Two men trapped in a glass tower on Christmas Eve, and the storm was only getting worse. The maintenance closet was a cramped, utilitarian space that smelled of dust and cleaning solution. Liam moved with an easy familiarity in the dark, his hand finding a large metal cabinet. He pulled out two thick gray blankets. They were coarse, industrial wool, nothing like the soft cashmere of my coat, but they looked incredibly warm. He handed one to me. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing. An accident. A synaptic misfire of nerve endings in the cold. But it felt like a jolt of low-voltage electricity, a current that shot up my arm and grounded itself somewhere deep in my chest. My mind, the over-analytical engine that never slept, immediately began to dissect the sensation. The brief friction of his calloused skin against mine, the surprising warmth of his hand. It was the first unplanned human contact I'd had in... I couldn't remember how long. My thoughts went into a spiral. It meant nothing. It was a purely physical reaction to an unexpected stimulus. He didn't even notice, but he did. I saw it in the way he paused for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering in the air between us before he withdrew it, in the way his gaze flickered from my hand to my eyes. He had felt it too. Or maybe I was just projecting my own desperate need for connection onto a complete stranger. "Here," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. He turned away, breaking the circuit, and retrieved a large stainless steel thermos from a shelf. We returned to the lobby, the vast cold space feeling even larger and emptier now. We didn't speak. We settled on one of the low leather couches near the security desk, an island in the sea of marble. We sat at opposite ends, the length of the couch a carefully measured, neutral territory. I wrapped the rough wool blanket around my shoulders, the unfamiliar texture a strange comfort. It felt more real than my expensive coat. Liam unscrewed the cap of the thermos, which doubled as a cup, and poured a stream of dark, steaming liquid. The rich, bitter scent of black coffee cut through the sterile air. It was the most welcoming smell I had encountered all day. He handed the cup to me. "I don't have another," he said. A simple statement, not an apology. "I don't mind," I replied, my voice quiet. The intimacy of sharing a cup felt both strangely archaic and deeply resonant. Another small, invisible line being crossed. I took a sip. The coffee was strong, scalding hot, and unsweetened. It was brutally effective. The heat spread through my chest, a welcome fire against the encroaching cold. I held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. He watched me drink, his own blanket draped over his shoulders. He wasn't staring, just observing. His presence was a solid, grounding weight on the other end of the couch. In the oppressive silence of the dead building, I was becoming hyper-aware of him. The soft rustle of his uniform as he shifted his weight. The almost inaudible sound of his breathing, slow and steady. A rhythm in the quiet. I found myself unconsciously trying to match it, a desperate, primal urge for synchronicity. Breathe in. Breathe out. Just like him, a current of heat seemed to radiate from him, a small pocket of warmth in the vast, refrigerated lobby. I felt the magnetic pull of it, the instinct to inch closer, to bridge the gap between us. I resisted, gripping the cup tighter, my knuckles white. This is insane. He's the security guard. I'm a partner at this firm. There are rules. There are lines. But the lines, like the city lights, had been blurred by the storm. The rules were written for a world that no longer existed, a world with electricity and functioning elevators and professional distance. In here, in this cold, dark space, we were just two people. I took another sip of coffee and passed the cup back to him. Our fingers brushed again. This time I was prepared for it. The jolt was still there, but it was less of a shock and more of a confirmation, a shared secret. He took a long drink, his throat moving as he swallowed. His eyes were fixed on the swirling snow outside, but I felt his awareness of me as a tangible pressure against my skin. The air between us was thick with unspoken things, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. We passed the cup back and forth in silence, a slow, deliberate ritual. With each exchange, the space between us seemed to shrink, the territory less neutral and more shared. I tracked the path of the cup, my eyes lingering on his hands. They were capable hands, clean but not soft, with long fingers and neatly trimmed nails. Hands that looked like they could fix things. My own hands, by contrast, looked pale and useless. They drafted contracts and signed checks. They had never fixed anything in their life. He finished the coffee and set the thermos on the floor with a soft thud. The silence that followed was heavier, no longer buffered by the small ritual of sharing a drink. I should say something. Thank him. Small talk. Anything to break the spell. But what was there to say? So, cold night, huh? Big storm. It was all so inadequate. The reality of our situation, the isolation, the shared warmth, the strange, burgeoning intimacy, was too immense for such small words. So I said nothing. I just watched the way the dim light carved shadows into the planes of his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight stubble that was starting to show there. He had a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made his otherwise composed face seem more human, more accessible. I wondered how he got it. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he felt this pull, this strange and terrifying sense of recognition, as if some part of my soul had been asleep and was just now waking up to the presence of its counterpart. He turned his head and looked at me. It wasn't a glance. It wasn't a casual shift of focus. It was a deliberate, full-on gaze. His eyes, that impossible shade of blue-green, locked onto mine. The analytical part of my brain shut down completely. The part that built walls and drafted escape clauses went silent. All that was left was the raw, primal core of me, pinned by that look. He saw me. I felt it with a certainty that was bone-deep and terrifying. He wasn't seeing Elijah Thorne, senior partner. He wasn't seeing the expensive suit or the carefully projected aura of untouchable competence. He was seeing the fraud underneath. The lonely, hollowed-out man who was hiding in his office on Christmas Eve because he had nowhere else to be. He saw the cracks in my armor, the fear in my eyes, the desperate yearning I kept locked away in the deepest dungeon of my heart. And he wasn't looking away. There was no judgment in his gaze, no pity, just a profound, unwavering stillness, a silent acknowledgement. I see you. My breath hitched. My carefully constructed composure, the work of a lifetime, shattered like a pane of glass. I felt a tremor start in my hands, a wave of vulnerability so intense it was dizzying. I was falling, crashing, drowning, all at once. I had the insane urge to confess everything, to pour out all the silent, ugly truths I'd spent my life concealing. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy. The walls of the lobby seemed to be closing in, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. Panic began to claw at my throat. I had to get away. I had to rebuild the walls. I made a move to stand, to retreat to the far side of the lobby, to put the distance back between us. "Don't," he said. Just one word. Soft, but with an undercurrent of command that stopped me cold. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I froze, half risen from the couch. He didn't move a muscle. He just held my gaze, his own unwavering. "Stay," he said, his voice even quieter than before, but somehow more powerful. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of need. His need, or mine, I couldn't tell. Maybe they were the same. Slowly, like a man in a trance, I sank back down onto the leather cushion. The surrender was total. I had no defenses left. The fortress had fallen. He finally broke the gaze, looking away toward the snow-swept plaza. The release was so abrupt I felt myself sway, gasping for air as if I'd been held underwater. "I took this shift for the holiday pay," he said, his voice low and even, as if he were talking about the weather. "Told my sister I had to work." A lie. The confession was so unexpected it took me a moment to process. It was a gift. A piece of his own vulnerability, offered to cover my own. "She has a new husband," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the storm. "And 3 kids. Her house, it's loud and bright, full of life." He said the last word like it was something foreign, something he admired from a distance but couldn't touch. My first Christmas without my mom. She passed in the spring. There it was. The crack in his facade. The source of the quiet sadness I now realized had been in his eyes all along. He wasn't just a calm, observant guard. He was a man in mourning, hiding in the same empty building I was, for his own reasons. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words felt like pebbles in my mouth, small and inadequate. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement. "Don't be. It just is." But being there, pretending to be happy, watching them all be a family, it felt harder than being here, alone. He finally looked back at me, and in his eyes I saw a reflection of my own profound isolation. We were 2 different kinds of lonely, hiding in the same storm. His was born of loss, mine of a deliberate, lifelong self-exile. But the result was the same. Something inside me shifted. The last remnants of my panic receded, replaced by a feeling I hadn't recognized in myself for a very long time. A fierce, primal, protective instinct. This man, this stranger who had just seen the most broken parts of me and hadn't flinched, was in pain. And I had an overwhelming, illogical urge to fix it, to offer some comfort, to shield him from the storm, both outside and in. The roles had reversed. I was no longer the one being seen, the one being rescued. On impulse, I reached out and unwrapped the cashmere scarf from around my neck. It was absurdly expensive. A gift to myself after closing a particularly soulless deal. I had never particularly liked it. I held it out to him. He looked at the scarf, then at my face, confusion flickering in his eyes. "You're colder than I am," I said, my voice hoarse. "Your coat is thinner." It was a clumsy, practical excuse for an act that felt anything but practical. It was an offering, my own small piece of vulnerability. He hesitated for a long moment, his gaze searching mine. I could see the debate happening behind his eyes. To accept was to cross another line, to deepen this strange, unspoken pact between us. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. His fingers, rough and warm, brushed against mine for the 3rd time. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact lingered, a silent acknowledgement. He didn't put the scarf on. He just held it in his hands, running his thumb over the soft, expensive fabric. He looked down at it, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "My mom used to knit me scarves," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They were never this soft, always a bit itchy, but they were warm." My heart clenched. I had offered him a luxury item, and he had transformed it into a memory. He had taken my clumsy gesture and given it a soul. We sat in silence for a long time after that. But it was a different kind of silence. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the sharp, anxious tension of before. It was a deeper, heavier thing. A shared gravity. The space between us on the couch no longer felt like a chasm. It felt like a charged, sacred space. A field of potential energy. The wind howled, rattling the huge panes of glass. The building groaned around us like a great, sleeping beast. I could feel the temperature dropping steadily, a creeping, insidious cold that the wool blanket couldn't entirely defeat. I shivered, a small, involuntary tremor. Liam noticed immediately. "We need more heat," he said, his voice practical again, pulling me back from the edge of whatever emotional precipice I was teetering on. "The emergency power runs the server room coolers on a priority circuit. It's the one place in the building that will be warm." Of course. The servers. The firm's electronic brain, worth more than all the humans who worked here combined. It would be protected at all costs. "Can we get in?" I asked. "I can," he said simply. He stood up, his movements fluid and certain. He was back in his element, a man with a purpose. He offered me a hand. I looked at his outstretched hand. It was an anchor in the dark. A choice. I could take it and follow him deeper into this strange, shared night. Or I could refuse and stay here alone in the cold. It wasn't a choice at all. I placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding. His palm was warm and slightly rough against mine. He pulled me to my feet effortlessly. And then, he didn't let go. He held my hand as he led me through the dark, cavernous lobby, our footsteps echoing on the marble. It was the most natural and the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. Every screaming instinct told me to pull away, to reestablish the boundaries, to retreat into the safety of my isolation. But the feeling of his hand wrapped around mine was a stronger force, a gravitational pull I had no desire to resist. I was being led through the darkness by a man I barely knew, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely, utterly safe. The server room was on a sublevel, a place I had never been. The air grew warmer as we descended another flight of stairs. Liam unlocked a heavy steel door with a key from the large ring on his belt. The moment he opened the door, a wave of dry, warm air washed over us, accompanied by a deafening roar. Inside, rows and rows of black server towers blinked with a million tiny green and amber lights, their cooling fans creating a sound like a jet engine. It was a stark, inhuman kind of warmth. But it was warmth nonetheless. Liam led me inside, closing the heavy door behind us. The roar of the fans instantly encapsulated us, cutting us off from the rest of the building, the rest of the world. The silence of the lobby was gone, replaced by this overwhelming, constant wall of sound. It was impossible to speak over it. We were in our own private bubble of heat and noise. He finally let go of my hand. The loss of contact was immediate and acute, a sudden cold patch on my skin. He pointed to a clear space on the floor against a wall, away from the main racks. It was the only area not cluttered with cables and equipment. He laid his blanket down, then gestured for me to do the same, creating a small, makeshift island for us on the cold, raised floor. We sat down, our shoulders almost touching. The noise was too loud for conversation, so we just sat, leaning against the wall, the warmth from the servers seeping into our bones. The roar of the fans was strangely calming. It was a white noise that drowned out everything else, including the frantic, analytical voice in my own head. There was no room for overthinking, for dissecting every glance and gesture. There was only the heat, the noise, and the solid presence of the man sitting next to me. I looked at him. His face was illuminated by the rhythmic blinking of the server lights. He had his eyes closed, his head tilted back against the wall. The cashmere scarf was still clutched in his hand. In the flashing lights, I could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. The calm, composed guard was gone. This was just Liam, a man grieving his mother, hiding from his family's happiness, and trying to make it through the night. Without thinking, I reached out. My hand hovered for a second before I rested it on his shoulder. It was a hesitant, uncertain touch. His eyes opened. He looked at my hand on his shoulder, then up at my face. The noise of the fans seemed to fade into the background. In his eyes, I saw a question. What is this? What are we doing? I didn't have an answer. I only knew that the thought of him being in pain was a physical ache in my own chest. I only knew that I didn't want him to be alone in it. I gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. A clumsy, silent attempt to convey something. Support, understanding, solidarity. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a subtle shift of weight that was a confession in itself. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, connected by that single point of contact. The blinking lights of the machines painted a silent, shifting ballet on our faces. The world was reduced to this one small, warm room. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day, the emotional turmoil of the night, caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavy. My head nodded forward once, twice. Liam shifted. He gently removed my hand from his shoulder. I thought he was pulling away, reestablishing the boundary, and a sharp, cold pang of disappointment went through me. But he wasn't. He moved so that his own shoulder was pressed firmly against mine, a solid wall of warmth and support. Then, he gently guided my head until it was resting on his shoulder. My mind screamed in protest. This is too much. Too close. Too intimate. But my body, traitor that it was, betrayed me completely. It sagged against him with a relief so profound, it felt like a physical release of pain. The tension I'd been holding in my neck and shoulders for years seemed to dissolve. His shoulder was solid, warm. The rough fabric of his uniform shirt was a grounding, real texture beneath my cheek. I could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. I could smell him. Not cologne, just the clean, simple scent of laundry soap, wool, and something else that was uniquely him. It was the most comforting scent I had ever known. I was leaning on a stranger, a man whose last name I didn't even know, and I had never felt more at home. Just rest, Elijah, I heard him say, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest into my ear, somehow cutting through the roar of the fans. It was a command, an absolution, permission to finally let go. And so I did. I fell asleep in the heart of the machine, lulled by its roar, anchored by the warmth of the man beside me. I didn't dream. For the first time and as long as I could remember, my mind was simply quiet. I woke to silence, a deep, profound silence that was a stark contrast to the overwhelming noise of the server room. The roar of the fans was gone. The blinking lights on the racks were dark. The power was back on. For a moment, I was disoriented. My cheek was pressed against something warm and rough. An arm was draped loosely over my shoulders. My own hand was resting on his leg, my fingers curled into the fabric of his trousers. We were a tangle of limbs, two bodies that had sought out and found comfort in each other during the long, cold night. My head was still on Liam's shoulder. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. The first pale light of Christmas morning was filtering through a high, grimy window I hadn't noticed before, painting a gray stripe across the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize me. The rules were back. The world was back. The electricity was flowing, and with it, the rigid social structures, the professional distances, the lines that were not to be crossed. I was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. He was a security guard. I had spent the night sleeping on him like a lost child. I should move. Untangle myself. Pretend it never happened. Apologize for the lapse. But my body refused to obey. The thought of moving, of breaking this connection, of losing this incredible grounding warmth, was physically painful. This was the most real thing I had felt in a decade. To deny it now would be the greatest lie of all. I lay still, listening to him breathe, memorizing the weight of his arm on my shoulders, the solid feel of his body next to mine. This was a moment suspended in time, an impossible gift. I wanted to live in it forever. He stirred, his breathing changing. His arm tightened around me for a moment before he seemed to realize where it was. He went very still. Neither of us moved. We were both awake, both hyper-aware of our proximity, of the intimacy of our shared sleep. The silence in the room was electric, charged with all the things we hadn't said, all the things we had done. He was the one who moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his arm from my shoulders. He sat up, creating a space between us. The cold air rushed into the gap, and I felt the loss like a physical blow. I sat up too, not looking at him. I straightened my hopelessly wrinkled suit jacket, a futile attempt to reclaim some of my lost dignity, to put the armor back on. But it was useless. The armor was in pieces on the floor. "The power's back," I said, my voice a croak. "Yeah," he replied. His voice was rough with sleep. The silence that followed was the most excruciating of the entire night. This was the moment we would either acknowledge what had happened or retreat behind our respective walls and pretend we were strangers again. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. Please, I thought, don't let it end here. Don't let this just be a strange story we tell ourselves. I finally forced myself to look at him. He was already looking at me. His face was unreadable in the dim morning light, but his eyes were full of a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored my own. The quiet observer, the composed guard, was gone. This was just a man, scared and hopeful and uncertain. This was the final threshold, the moment of truth. "Stop pretending," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the silent room. My breath caught in my throat. "Pretending what?" I whispered, though I knew the answer. "That you're not waiting." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. He had distilled the entire night, my entire life, into that one sentence. I was always waiting. Waiting for the next deal to close, the next promotion, the next meaningless achievement to distract me from the profound, structural emptiness at my core. Waiting for something, anything, to make me feel real. His words were not an accusation. They were a challenge, a direct verbal plea to stop lying. To myself and to him. I had a choice. I could stand up, thank him for his help, and walk out of this room, back to my life of elegant isolation. I could pretend these last few hours were an anomaly, a strange dream brought on by a power failure and a snowstorm. Or I could choose the terrifying, exhilarating truth. I chose the truth. I don't want to wait anymore, I said. The confession felt like it was torn from the deepest part of me. It was the truest thing I had ever said. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching the sun rise. The tension that had held his body rigid seemed to melt away. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hand, the same hand he had offered me in the lobby. An anchor. A choice. This time, I didn't hesitate. I placed my hand in his, and our fingers intertwined. His grip was strong, sure. It felt like coming home. He stood, pulling me to my feet. We stood facing each other in the quiet server room, our hands clasped between us. The distance between us was barely a foot, but it felt charged with a universe of potential. The lie was dead. The pretense was gone. All that was left was the two of us, stripped bare of our roles and our armor, standing in the quiet truth of the morning after. "Liam," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what I was going to say next. I just needed to say his name, to make it real. "I know," he said softly. And he did. He knew everything. He raised his other hand and gently touched my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. The touch was feather light, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. It was a touch of incredible tenderness, of profound acceptance. It wasn't a touch of pity or of lust. It was a touch that said, "You are here, and I am here with you." And then I surrendered completely. I stepped forward, closing the final gap between us, and buried my face in the crook of his neck. My arms wrapped around his solid frame, holding on like a drowning man clinging to a raft. I breathed him in, the scent of soap and wool and him, and felt a lifetime of tension, of fear, of loneliness finally begin to break apart. His arms came around me, holding me tight, his hand coming up to cradle the back of my head. It wasn't a gentle embrace. It was fierce, desperate, grounding. It was the embrace of two people who had found each other in the dark and were not letting go. I felt a tremor run through his body. Or maybe it was mine. I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. We were just two souls, clinging to each other in the quiet hum of a building coming back to life. This was the confession. Not in words, but in the desperate, clinging pressure of our bodies. This was the surrender. My walls, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, didn't just crack. They collapsed. They turned to dust. And in their place was this solid, warm, breathing reality. We stood like that for a long, long time. There were no words. None were needed. The embrace said everything. I see you. I need you. Stay. When we finally, reluctantly, drew apart, the world felt different. The light filtering through the window was brighter. The air felt cleaner. We didn't let go of each other's hands. We walked out of the server room and up the stairs, our hands still linked. The lobby was bright with morning sun reflecting off the fresh, untouched snow outside. The world was clean and new. At the main doors, we stopped. This was it. The point where our shared world ended and the real world began again. The fear came back, a cold knot in my stomach. What now? Liam must have felt it, because he squeezed my hand. I looked at him, and he gave me a small, steady smile. It was the first time I had seen him smile. It transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "My shift ends in 10 minutes, he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but it held a question, an offer. "I'll wait," I said, the words coming out without a second thought. I would wait for him for 10 minutes, or 10 hours, or a lifetime. The waiting was over. He nodded, a look of quiet understanding passing between us. An unspoken pact. We would figure this out. Together. He let go of my hand and walked back to the security console to finish the last few minutes of his shift. I watched him go, the loss of his touch a dull ache. I stood by the glass doors, looking out at the silent, snow-covered city. The glass was no longer a barrier. It was just a window. And for the first time, I felt like I was on the right side of it. My fortress hadn't been made of glass and steel. It had been made of fear. My armor wasn't a suit. It was loneliness. The greatest strength, I realized, wasn't in building walls to keep the world out. It was in finding the one person you were brave enough to let inside. The coldest man in the firm was gone. In his place stood someone new. Someone who had been seen and held and saved. Not from a snowstorm, but from himself. I watched Liam log out of his system and grab his coat. He walked toward me, his steps sure and steady. He was no longer just the security guard. He was the man who had my hand, and my hope, and my heart. And it was Christmas morning, and we were just getting started.